I still remember the exact moment everything inside me finally snapped, because it wasn't loud or dramatic at first. It was quiet, almost gentle, the way breaking points often are. My stepsister stood in the middle of the kitchen, one hand resting proudly on her stomach, the other holding a chipped coffee mug she hadn't washed herself. She smiled like this was good news for everyone, like it was a gift we should all be grateful for. Then she said it casually, like she was announcing a weather update. She was pregnant again, her 7th time. The word 7th echoed in my head, bouncing off years of exhaustion, resentment, and silence. I felt my chest tighten, not with joy, but with a deep, familiar dread that settled into my bones. I already knew what this meant. More diapers I would buy, more nights I would stay awake, more school forms with my name on them instead of hers. If you want the full truth, hit like so this story reaches more people, because stories like this stay hidden when they shouldn't. I didn't always hate her. That's the part people don't understand when they hear what happened next. When my dad married her mom, I tried. I really did. She was older than me by 4 years, loud, impulsive, always chasing the next thing that made her feel important. I was quieter, more responsible, the kind of person adults leaned on without asking if I could handle the weight. When she had her first baby at 19, everyone panicked, but I stepped up. I learned how to warm bottles, how to rock a screaming infant at 3 in the morning, how to miss my own plans without complaining. The second baby came before the first could walk, and by then it was already expected that I would help. By the third, people stopped asking and started assuming. Somewhere between the 4th and 5th child, I stopped being a sister and became a built-in parent, unpaid and invisible. The house we lived in always felt too small, even when it was quiet. Toys littered the floor like landmines. Laundry baskets overflowed no matter how often I washed clothes. There was a constant hum of noise, cartoons blaring, kids arguing, babies crying, doors slamming. My stepsister floated through it all like chaos was just part of her personality, like responsibility was something that happened to other people. She would disappear for hours, sometimes days, chasing boyfriends, chasing attention, chasing anything except motherhood. And every time she left, she'd say the same thing. "You've got this, right?" She never waited for an answer. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself family helps family. I told myself the kids needed me, and that part was true. They clung to me because I was consistent. I knew their favorite snacks, their bedtime routines, the way they liked their stories read. I signed permission slips, attended parent-teacher meetings, and learned how to calm nightmares that weren't even mine to fix. But with every sacrifice, something in me hardened. I started to feel like my life was paused, while hers kept spinning forward, reckless and free. By the time she announced her 7th pregnancy, I was working full-time and studying part-time, barely holding myself together. That morning had already been long. I'd packed lunches, dropped kids at school, cleaned up a mess she left behind, and rushed home just in time to hear her news. She expected congratulations. She expected excitement. What she got instead was silence. My hands shook as I set my bag down. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. She laughed, mistaking my silence for shock. I know," she said, rolling her eyes. "Crazy, right? But you're so good with them, I don't know what I'd do without you." That sentence did it. Not the pregnancy, not the number. That certainty in her voice, the absolute confidence that I would continue to sacrifice my entire existence so she wouldn't have to change anything. Something inside me broke cleanly, like a rope finally snapping under too much strain. I looked around the kitchen, at the high chairs I'd scrubbed, the floors I'd mopped, the fridge I'd stocked with my own money. I thought about the nights I cried quietly so no one would hear. I thought about the opportunities I'd turned down, the friendships that faded because I was always busy being needed. I realized in that moment that if I didn't choose myself now, I never would. The anger that rose up wasn't explosive. It was cold and steady, the kind that makes decisions clear. I asked her who the father was this time. She shrugged, literally shrugged like it was a minor detail. "We'll figure it out," she said. "We always do." That was when I felt something shift permanently between us. I wasn't just tired, I was done. I told her calmly at first that I couldn't do this anymore, that I wasn't raising another child that wasn't mine. She laughed again, but this time there was an edge to it. She thought I was bluffing. She thought I'd cool down like always. She didn't see the resolve in my eyes, or maybe she did and chose to ignore it. I walked out of the kitchen and into my room, closing the door softly behind me. My hands were still shaking, but my mind was clear for the first time in years. I sat on my bed and stared at the wall, listening to the noise of the house continue without me. For the first time, I didn't rush to fix anything. I didn't step in. I didn't rescue anyone. That night, lying in the dark, I made a decision that would change everything. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold yet, or how ugly it would get, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was no longer going to set myself on fire to keep my stepsister warm, and once that realization took hold, there was no going back. The next morning didn't explode the way people imagine confrontations do. There was no screaming match, no dramatic showdown right away. Instead, it was worse in a quieter way. I woke up to the sound of one of the toddlers crying and the older kids arguing over cereal, the same routine that had ruled my life for years. My body moved on autopilot at first, muscle memory dragging me out of bed before my brain could catch up. Halfway down the hallway, I stopped. The house sounded chaotic, but for the first time, I didn't rush. I stood there, barefoot on the cold floor, and reminded myself of the promise I'd made in the dark the night before. This was not my responsibility anymore. I went into the kitchen anyway, not to fix things, but to observe. My stepsister sat at the table scrolling on her phone, completely unfazed by the noise around her. One child tugged at her arm, another spilled milk across the counter, and she didn't even look up. When she finally noticed me standing there, she smiled like nothing had changed. "Can you get them ready?" she asked. Not please, not can you help, just an assumption wrapped in laziness. I told her no, just one word spoken evenly. No excuses, no explanation. The smile slid off her face like it had never belonged there. She stared at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. "What do you mean no?" she said, her voice sharpening. I repeated myself, a little firmer this time. No. I grabbed my bag and my keys, stepped around the mess, and walked out the door while the noise behind me spiked into confusion and anger. At work, my phone buzzed nonstop. Missed calls. Texts that started confused, then irritated, then outright hostile. She accused me of abandoning her, of being selfish, of ruining her life. I didn't respond. Every message felt like another confirmation that I was doing the right thing. Still, guilt crept in around the edges. I worried about the kids. I worried about what would happen when I wasn't there to smooth things over. That guilt had been her most effective weapon for years, and it didn't disappear overnight. When I came home that evening, the house looked like a tornado had passed through. Dirty dishes stacked in the sink, trash overflowing, kids unsupervised and irritable. My stepsister stood in the living room, arms crossed, eyes blazing. She launched into me the second I closed the door, accusing me of making her look bad, of stressing her out during her pregnancy, of turning my back on family. I listened quietly, something I'd learned to do well. When she finally ran out of breath, I told her I was moving out. The room went silent, then she laughed loud and sharp. "You can't," she said. "You don't have anywhere to go, and even if you did, you wouldn't leave them." She gestured toward the kids like they were leverage, not people. That laugh hurt more than any insult she could have thrown at me. It showed me exactly how she saw me, not as a sister, not even as a person, just a resource she was entitled to use. I told her she was wrong. I had savings she didn't know about, scraped together dollar by dollar from overtime shifts and small sacrifices. I had a plan forming in my head, fragile but real. Her face darkened as she realized I wasn't bluffing. The insults escalated. She called me ungrateful. She reminded me of everything she'd done for me, which mostly amounted to letting me live in a house I paid for in more ways than one. Then she went for the jugular. She told me the kids would hate me, that they'd feel abandoned, that I was just like everyone else who had failed them. That night, I barely slept. I packed quietly, taking only what was mine. Every item I folded into my bag felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. The kids watched me with confused eyes, and that nearly broke me. I knelt down and hugged them, told them I loved them, told them I wasn't disappearing. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep, but I didn't let my stepsister rewrite the narrative either. She hovered nearby, watching, silent and seething. I left before sunrise, heart pounding as I pulled away from the only home I'd known for years. The relief was immediate and crushing at the same time. I cried while driving, not because I regretted leaving, but because I finally understood how heavy the burden had been. I stayed with a friend at first, sleeping on a couch, then found a small place of my own. It wasn't much. Bare walls, mismatched furniture, silence that felt almost too loud. But it was mine. The fallout didn't stop there. She told everyone her version of the story, that I'd abandoned a pregnant woman, that I was heartless. Family members started calling, some concerned, some accusatory. I learned quickly who actually cared about my well-being and who just wanted me to resume my role as the fixer. I held my ground. Every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself why I'd left. I reminded myself of the 7th pregnancy announcement, the shrug, the assumption. If you're listening to this, and you believe she deserved justice for the way she used and manipulated me, comment justice, because sometimes naming the truth is the first step to breaking free from it. Weeks passed and cracks began to show in the life I'd been holding together for her. Bills went unpaid. Schools called. Other relatives stepped in, only to step back out again when they realized how much work was actually involved. She tried to pull me back in with apologies that didn't last, promises that rang hollow. Each time I said no. Each time it got easier. I didn't become cruel. I didn't celebrate her struggle. I simply stopped sacrificing myself to prevent it. And that decision changed the trajectory of my life in ways I couldn't have imagined back in that kitchen. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The real consequences for both of us were still ahead. The first real test of my resolve came a month after I moved out, when my phone rang late at night and I saw my stepsister's name flashing on the screen. For a few seconds, I just stared at it, my heart thudding like it used to every time she needed something. Old habits die hard, and part of me still wanted to answer automatically, to jump into crisis mode before I even knew what the problem was. I let it ring out. Almost immediately, a text followed, then another, and another. By the time I picked up my phone again, there were 14 messages stacked on top of each other, each one more frantic than the last. She said one of the kids was sick. She said she didn't know what to do. She said she needed me right now. The words were carefully chosen, pressing on all the old pressure points she knew so well. I sat on the edge of my bed in my tiny apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside, and forced myself to breathe. I reminded myself that she wasn't calling because she'd suddenly learned to respect me. She was calling because I wasn't there anymore. I texted her back one sentence: "Call the pediatrician or go to urgent care." Then I turned my phone face down and didn't look at it again until morning. The next day, guilt tried to claw its way back in. I replayed her messages in my head while I made coffee, imagining worst-case scenarios. But when I finally checked my phone, there was nothing new. No emergency updates. No thank you, just silence. That silence taught me something important. She had figured it out. She always did when she had no other choice. That realization didn't make me feel proud or vindicated. It made me sad, because it proved that I had been carrying weight she was perfectly capable of lifting herself, if only she'd been forced to. As weeks turned into months, my life slowly started to expand into the space I'd carved out for it. I had energy again. I slept through the night. I went to work without rushing home to another unpaid shift. I even laughed more, a sound that felt strange coming out of me at first, like I was borrowing someone else's voice. But every step forward I took seemed to trigger a new attempt from my stepsister to pull me back. She showed up unannounced at my job once, visibly pregnant and visibly angry, accusing me of ruining her life in front of strangers. I didn't engage. I asked security to escort her out, my hands shaking but my voice steady. Walking away from that scene felt surreal, like watching someone else live my life. Not everyone supported my decision. Some family members told me I needed to be the bigger person. Others said I should think about the kids before myself. I listened, nodded, and changed the subject. They didn't see the nights I'd spent crying in bathrooms. They hadn't felt the constant anxiety, the sense that my entire existence was being consumed by someone else's choices. It was easy for them to preach sacrifice when they weren't the ones paying the price. If you're still with me right now, type yes if you want to see all targets hit at once, because this story isn't just about walking away. It's about what happens after, when patterns finally collide with consequences. The breaking point for my stepsister came faster than I expected. Without me quietly managing everything behind the scenes, the cracks in her life widened. School officials started calling other relatives. Bills piled up. The fathers of her children were nowhere to be found. excuses drying up as responsibilities increased. She tried to paint herself as a victim, but without someone else absorbing the fallout, her narrative began to unravel. People started to see what I'd been shielding them from for years. One afternoon, I received a message from a distant aunt who had temporarily stepped in to help. She didn't accuse me or guilt-trip me. She simply said, "I didn't realize how much you were doing." I stared at that message for a long time, feeling a mix of relief and grief. Relief that someone finally understood. Grief for the years I'd lost being misunderstood. My stepsister didn't apologize, not really. Her version of remorse came wrapped in demands and desperation. She suggested we start fresh, which meant I move back in and things go back to the way they were. When I said no, calmly and without explanation, she snapped. She told me I thought I was better than her now. She told me I'd regret this. She told me family doesn't abandon family. I listened without interrupting, then ended the call. I realized in that moment that her anger wasn't about losing me emotionally. It was about losing control. Share this video so communities understand what was hiding in plain sight for so long. Because stories like mine are dismissed every day as exaggerations until someone finally speaks up. There were moments when I questioned myself. Moments when loneliness crept in and whispered that maybe it would have been easier to stay. But every time I visited the old neighborhood and saw the house still in disarray, every time I heard another story about unpaid bills or missed appointments, I knew I'd made the right choice. Distance gave me clarity. It showed me that love doesn't mean limitless sacrifice, and responsibility doesn't mean erasing yourself. The kids remained the hardest part. I missed them deeply. I stayed in touch when I could, sent gifts, checked in through other relatives. I held firm to my boundaries, even when it hurt. I understood something crucial then. Saving myself didn't mean I stopped caring. It meant I stopped enabling a system that was breaking all of us. I couldn't be the solution to problems I didn't create, especially when being the solution was slowly destroying me. Looking back, I see how quietly trapped I was, how normalized the imbalance had become. It didn't start with 7 kids. It started with one small compromise, then another, then a lifetime of them. Walking away wasn't a single dramatic act. It was a series of choices, made over and over again, to value my own life as much as I'd been taught to value everyone else's. The real shift happened quietly, without a single dramatic moment to announce it. One day I realized I was no longer waiting for my phone to vibrate with her name. The anxiety that used to live permanently in my chest had loosened its grip. I could make plans without calculating how they might fall apart at the last minute. I could sit in silence without feeling guilty for not being useful. That freedom felt unfamiliar at first, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit yet, but with time, it began to feel natural. I started investing in myself in ways I never had before, enrolling in a certification course I'd put off for years, staying late at work because I wanted to, not because I had to make up for someone else's mess. Of course, my stepsister didn't fade quietly into the background. She escalated. When pleading stopped working, she turned to blame. She told relatives I'd brainwashed the kids against her. She hinted online that I'd stolen money from her. None of it was true, but the accusations still stung. I learned a hard lesson then. When you stop being useful to someone who benefits from your silence, they often try to destroy your credibility. It wasn't about truth anymore. It was about regaining control. One afternoon, I was called into my manager's office. For a split second, panic flared, a reflex I hadn't quite shaken. Then he explained that someone had contacted the company, making vague claims about my character. My stomach dropped. I told him everything calmly and honestly, laying out the history I'd kept hidden for so long. He listened without interrupting, then surprised me by thanking me for my transparency. "You're one of our most reliable employees," he said. "I'm not concerned." I walked out of that office feeling 10 pounds lighter. The truth, spoken plainly, had power I'd underestimated. That incident marked another turning point. I stopped hiding my story, not in a dramatic, oversharing way, but in an honest one. When people asked why I'd moved out, I told them. When family members hinted that I should reconcile, I explained why I wouldn't. Some understood, some didn't, but I no longer felt the need to convince anyone. I'd spent too long justifying my existence. The ripple effects continued. Without my constant support, systems that relied on my unpaid labor began to collapse. Schools involved social services. Relatives who had criticized me were suddenly overwhelmed by requests for help. I didn't take pleasure in it, but I didn't rush in to fix it either. For the first time, consequences were landing where they belonged. Then came the message that shook me more than I expected. One of the older kids reached out, confused and angry. They asked why I'd left. They asked if it was their fault. That message broke my heart open. I met them in a neutral place, away from the house, and told them the truth in age-appropriate words. I explained that adults are responsible for their choices, and sometimes stepping away is the only way to stop a bad situation from getting worse. I told them I loved them, that I always would, but that loving them didn't mean sacrificing myself. They listened quietly. I don't know how much they understood in that moment, but I know they felt seen, and that mattered. My stepsister found out about that meeting and exploded. She accused me of turning her children against her, of poisoning their minds. Her words were sharp and desperate, laced with fear she'd never admit to. I realized then that she wasn't just losing help. She was losing the narrative. For years, I'd been the silent backdrop that made her chaos look survivable. Without me, the story changed. If this part of the story shocked you, comment shocked below, because the hardest truths are often the ones no one prepares you for. As my life stabilized, hers continued to unravel. I heard through the grapevine about missed appointments, arguments with landlords, strained relationships. Each update confirmed what I already knew. My presence had been a buffer, not a solution. Removing myself hadn't created the problems, it had simply revealed them. There were moments of grief, too. Grief for the sister I'd hoped she could be. Grief for the family dynamic I'd imagined was possible if I just tried harder. Letting go of that fantasy was painful, but necessary. You can't heal in the same environment that keeps hurting you, and you can't save someone who refuses to be accountable. Slowly, I began to imagine a future that wasn't defined by damage control. I made friends who knew me as more than the responsible one. I traveled, even if it was just a weekend away, marveling at how light I felt without a mental checklist of obligations trailing behind me. I learned who I was when I wasn't constantly reacting to someone else's crisis. Looking back now, the 7th pregnancy announcement feels like a line drawn in bold ink across my life. Before it, I existed for everyone else. After it, I chose myself. That choice didn't make me cruel. It made me honest. And honesty, I've learned, is far kinder in the long run than resentment ever is. By the time the baby was born, I was no longer part of the daily updates, the frantic group messages, or the carefully curated social media posts meant to convince the world everything was fine. I heard about the birth through someone else, weeks later as an afterthought. A healthy baby, another mouth to feed, another life dropped into a system already buckling under its own weight. I felt a strange mix of emotions when I heard the news. Relief that I wasn't there. Sadness for the child. And a quiet, steady certainty that I had made the only choice that would have kept me alive in the long run. My stepsister tried one last time to reassert control, and this time she changed tactics completely. Instead of rage or accusations, she went silent. No calls, no messages, no public drama. At first, the quiet felt peaceful. Then it started to feel deliberate. Mutual relatives told me she was telling people I'd chosen a new life and didn't care anymore. That I'd abandoned everyone the moment things got hard. I recognized the strategy immediately. If she couldn't pull me back through guilt or fear, she'd try to punish me through isolation. It almost worked. There were moments when I felt like I was floating on the edge of my own family, disconnected from traditions and gatherings I used to anchor. But then something unexpected happened. People started asking questions. They started comparing stories. They noticed patterns. And slowly, quietly, the version of events she'd been selling began to crack. A cousin pulled me aside at a family function and said, "I didn't believe you at first, but now I see it." That sentence mattered more than she would ever know. Around that same time, I got a promotion at work. Nothing flashy, but meaningful. More responsibility, more pay, and most importantly, respect. I celebrated alone in my apartment, takeout on the table, music playing softly in the background. It wasn't the celebration I'd once imagined for myself, but it was honest. Every step forward I took was mine. unburdened by someone else's expectations. The kids remained a constant presence in my thoughts. I worried about them, especially the older ones, who were old enough to see the dysfunction clearly but too young to escape it. I stayed in touch where I could, always careful not to undermine their mother, but also refusing to lie. I focused on being a stable, truthful adult in their lives, even from a distance. Sometimes that meant listening without fixing. Sometimes it meant saying, "That's not okay," and leaving it at that. What surprised me most was how much my own identity began to solidify once I stopped being consumed by crisis management. I discovered interests I'd shelved for years. I reconnected with friends who hadn't given up on me, even when I'd canceled plans 100 times. I started to understand how deeply I'd internalized the belief that my worth came from being needed. Letting go of that belief was harder than leaving the house had been. It required me to sit with discomfort, to accept that I didn't have to earn rest or happiness. My stepsister, meanwhile, struggled with the consequences of being fully responsible for her choices. Without me quietly absorbing the impact, every missed payment, every late pickup, every broken promise landed squarely on her shoulders. I didn't celebrate that. I didn't gloat. But I didn't intervene either. There's a difference between compassion and self-destruction, and I'd finally learned where that line was. One evening, months later, I received a message that felt like a full-circle moment. It was from one of the kids, older now, more aware. They thanked me, not for leaving exactly, but for being honest, for showing them that it was possible to choose a different path. I cried when I read it, the kind of tears that come from release, not pain. It was confirmation that my decision, painful as it had been, hadn't been meaningless. As I reflect on everything now, I see how easily situations like mine get minimized. People say things like, "That's just family," or "You only get one." They don't talk enough about what happens when family becomes a justification for exploitation, when love is used as leverage instead of support. Walking away isn't always about anger. Sometimes it's about survival. Sometimes it's about giving yourself permission to stop drowning. If you've been listening to this and seeing pieces of your own life reflected back at you, I want you to know something important. You are not selfish for wanting peace. You are not cruel for setting boundaries. And you are not responsible for fixing problems you didn't create, no matter how loudly someone insists otherwise. The 7th pregnancy wasn't just an announcement. It was a mirror, held up to years of imbalance I could no longer ignore. Saying, I was fed up doesn't even begin to cover it. I was empty. And choosing myself was the only way to fill that emptiness with something real. I didn't realize how much of myself I had been holding back until one quiet morning when I woke up without dread sitting on my chest. There was no rush to check messages, no mental list of emergencies waiting for me to solve. Just sunlight through the window and the steady realization that my time finally belonged to me. That was when it hit me that freedom isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrives softly, in moments of peace you didn't know were possible. Life didn't magically become perfect after I walked away. There were still hard days, lonely nights, moments when the weight of everything I'd been through came crashing back without warning. But the difference was that those struggles were mine, not borrowed from someone else's chaos. I could face them without resentment. I could grow instead of just survive. Over time, the anger I once felt toward my stepsister faded into something quieter and more distant. Not forgiveness, exactly, but acceptance. Acceptance that she might never change. Acceptance that her choices were never about me, even when I was the one paying the price. Letting go of the need for her to understand my pain was one of the hardest and most freeing things I've ever done. I stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. I stopped hoping she would suddenly see me, really see me, and acknowledge what I had given up. That hope had kept me tethered longer than anything else. Once I released it, the last of the invisible strings snapped. The kids are still part of my heart. That will never change. I think about them often and hope that, in their own time, they find their way toward lives that are lighter and kinder than the one they were born into. If my leaving showed them anything, I hope it showed them that endurance isn't the same as happiness, and that love should never require you to disappear. Sometimes I replay that moment in the kitchen, the announcement of the 7th pregnancy, and I see it differently now. Back then, it felt like betrayal. Now I see it as clarity. It forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding for years. I was sacrificing my future for someone who had no intention of protecting it. That realization hurt, but it also saved me. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that boundaries aren't punishments. They're protections. They don't mean you love less. They mean you finally love yourself enough to stop accepting what harms you. Walking away wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of courage. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Ask yourself where you might be overgiving, where you might be carrying weight that was never meant to be yours. And remember this, you are allowed to choose yourself, even when others do like it. Before this ends, I want to ask you 3 things. First, if this story helped you see things more clearly, hit like so more people who are silently struggling can find it. Second, tell me in the comments, do you think I was right to walk away, or should family always come first no matter the cost? And finally, subscribe to this channel because these stories matter. They remind us that justice isn't always loud, and strength isn't always visible, but choosing yourself can change everything.